For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, welcome. I am excited to come to you again with yet another insight or message or whatever you want to call it. Um, so today is going to be very special, and it's just kind of been building up and has an amazingness to it. So a couple things we need to do. We're going to need to lay some groundwork. We're going to lay some groundwork with some grammar, and we're going to lay some groundwork with the other processes that we need to get into, which have to do with some specific Hebrew words and some actions and processes. So, in that light, let's start with the fact that for the counting of the Omer, for those who honor the counting of the Omer from the first Sabbath, that's the actual Saturday after Passover, we are actually on day 28. Well, what does that mean? Well, we were supposed to count 49 days plus one, right? We were supposed to count 7 weeks of seven, right? Days. And so 49 plus one is 50. 50 divided by two is 25. So 25, or the 25th day of Omer, actually marks the checkpoint difference between the downward or descension side versus the ascension side of the physical versus the spiritual. So we've got a lot to cover and a lot of things to get into. But the first thing that I want to do is talk about this concept of ascension and descension in terms of the feast day season. So we'll go ahead and we'll jump on the board really quick and get an understanding of what it actually means that we arrived at day 25 of the counting of the Omer. So let's go ahead and we'll jump over to the board and we'll get that action going. So first of all, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that obviously we have our three dots. You guys know this very well. You guys know this. This is going to be Passover, right? And then this is going to be Pentecost. Okay. And then this is going to be Tabernacles. Okay. And one of the things I want you to remember is there is kind of an elimination of Egypt here, right? And when we say Egypt, we're not talking about the modern day country. We're talking about the nation of Egypt at the time. There was a deliverance of the Hebrews, and that deliverance timeline wise leads us down this line, right? And so we know that in between let's see, let's mark this in purple here as being, oh wait, yeah, okay. So we'll mark this in purple as being the Passover season and very specifically the 50 days, as it were. Now, I know that we're actually counting the Omer from that Shabbat after Passover, but the season itself lasts until we get to Pentecost. Okay. So Passover lasts until Pentecost. That's the season of Passover, which has the counting of the 50 days of Omer in it. Okay. And so in principle, the Passover season begins on the night of the 14th of Nisan, or the 14th of the first month, when the barley is aviv, or the barley is green for harvest. Then on the Shabbat that follows, which could potentially be the next day, or it can potentially be all the way at the other end of the week. So there can be up to 7 days or up to one day. Then we start counting the Omer. So roughly about 57 days, as it were, to get to Pentecost. But the specific season of the counting of the Omer is the actual ascension and descension in process. So let me explain how that's going. So let's say that we go ahead and mark out the ascension and descension of the physical realm. So this is the descension and ascension of the physical realm, with this point right here marking the 25th day of Omer. Why does that create the halfway point? Well, even though that the Passover season begins with Passover and ends with Pentecost, and even though that there is the concept of um, the Omer possibly beginning the day after Passover or possibly beginning a week after Passover. So, like for example, if Passover fell actually on a Shabbat, then you would not get to the counting of the Omer until that next week. Okay. But the point behind it is that when the Omer starts, that's when this descension starts. And I'm going to explain why here in a minute. So the best way I could put it to you is there is a dialing back, or there is a reduction in any type of uh, intervention of provision, protection, and instruction from the intensification of all power in the universe. So let me see if I can word that a little bit simpler, because I know that probably sounded really confusing. But the way that you want to think about this is that from this point right here, there is actually going to be a reduction in provision, protection, and instruction from the intensification of all power in the universe. In other words, there's no longer going to be a divine intervention on what's happening in your life on your behalf. Okay. According to Deuteronomy chapter 8, the reason for that is to expose the impurities of your heart. And according to the counting of the Omer, there are 50 impurities that need to be exposed and 50 impurities that need to be shown to need change or whatever, right? So in that process, this is what I want you to think about. And let's go ahead and talk about this for a moment. We'll come back to the board here in a minute. But one of the things that I want you to think about is this idea that we have this hindsight, right? We read this story about the Israelites, and as soon as we read this story about the Israelites, we instantaneously make judgments about them, about Yahweh, etc., etc. But if we were the ones experiencing it, here's how it would go. In its simplicity, you would actually go from a place where you had water, food, etc., to a place where there was no water, no food, and also there was a threat that had to do with no protection. Okay. And so the way I want you to think about this is that as we're going through this dissension process, in that dissension process, there's going to be things that cause your heart to demonstrate your darkness. Okay. The short version of this is we call this the wilderness season, because literally the Israelites went from the Red Sea and the seven palms, where they evidently had what they needed because there was no complaining there, to a place where they no longer had what they needed. And it just got worse and worse and worse and worse until right before the manna came. Okay. Now, there is a reason why this is so important, because that midway point, that doesn't necessarily represent an amount of days, but instead an experience, needs to be understood from a human perspective. And what's that human perspective? They were thirsty. You know, the moment you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. You know, the moment you start craving salt, you're already dehydrated, right? And here's the crazy part is we could just go and grab a bottle of water and take it to the face and not even think about the fact that there was no water. Now, I've been on a few hikes where I've ran out of water in the desert, and I can tell you those have been very dramatic moments for me because it's like not only are you not close to water, but you are not close to water for a while, right? Like I've been up on a cliff before, and had a situation where we ran out of water, and it was still a good 2 miles to the car. And then you have to drive the car somewhere and get water because you can't just go drink it out of the river, right? Unless you have a filter or something, but we didn't. And so as a result of that, there's a panic that happens. I mean, I'm drinking that last little sip of water thinking, man, we got to get to the car. And then realizing I've still got 2 miles to go. And if I'm walking, even walking at a speed of like 3 miles an hour, which is kind of like a really good gait, um, it's still a while, right? So there's obviously an appreciation. There's an understanding that can be gained from running out of water on a hike in the wilderness. But it still doesn't jive with the idea that this entire people is out in this desert region without any water. And so in its simplicity, they start to panic, right? Well, as soon as the panic sets in, then their mouths start running, right? Their mouths start confessing what is in the abundance of the heart. Remember, Yeshua said, out of the abundance of the heart, all evil things come. Well, what's evil again? It's the twisted head, right? It's the twisted rope and the human head together, an idea of the head twisting, right? The head manipulating reality, right? That's why we have an understanding that there's one tree in the garden. It was the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And Adam's brain twisted it into what it was instead of what it actually was in reality. Okay, that's for another discussion. But the premise is that we need to understand that once they started twisting reality and they start confessing those things with their mouth. Well, in general, the way you want to think about this is that the wilderness season is to get you to confess those impurities. You speak them. Things like, I hate you, or I hate this place, or I don't want this, or I don't like this, right? Complaining. In fact, there's actually a verse in Deuteronomy that says the people became like those who complain. They conform to people who complain. Why does it say they conform? Because the people's minds were exposed to a higher consciousness at Sinai. But they hadn't arrived there yet, right? They had not arrived at Sinai. They hadn't arrived at a higher conscience. And there was definitely not the ascension yet. And we're going to talk about ascension and descension in a minute. But the premise in general is going to be that there was no manna. There was no water from the rock. There was no thought process of protection beyond the fact that the Egyptians had gotten washed away in the Red Sea. So all of a sudden, out in the middle of nowhere, the wilderness hits. And the wilderness hits, and all of a sudden you're hungry, you're thirsty, and there's no protection from attacks. Now, what's interesting about those attacks is those attacks are actually coming from a side of you that is actually causing it to be worse than what it actually is, right? And so the little tiny things that happen are all exposing your heart, and very specifically, those 50 impurities, which are the opposites of the emanations of God. Okay. Now, of course, you hear me using emanations of God in the sense of what? The intensification of all power in the universe, not God as when we're talking about Elohim. Okay. Elohim and the intensification of all power in the universe are two different things. So it is very important that we first understand that at this midway point, which isn't the 25, I'll explain the 25 in a minute, but at this midway point is when we have the provision, protection, and instruction begin to be reinserted into the process. So literally from day 25 onward, you should start to experience an increase in provision, protection, and instruction that kind of gives you the impression that, oh, I'm back on track with God. But you need to understand that that hunger satiation, that thirst quenching, and that protection from the intensification of all power in the universe as an intervention in the common processes of life is actually a very gradual process. And under the right circumstances, we also need to understand that you had to hit a certain rock bottom before those things could start to occur. Okay. So when we're talking about the exposition of the heart, when we're talking about there being an actual exposition, when there's an exposing of these things, you need to understand there's an ebb and flow in the process. So the first thing that I would like to do is explain and I'll do it on the board here. So what I want to do first is kind of show you the principle of descension, okay? Descension, which is going to be in the physical realm a process of lack and decrease. Okay. Remember, this is a result of fruit, right? We know that this is a reaping season. Okay. But one of the other principles that you need to understand is that this descension is reducing something in the physical realm. There's an actual apparent losing of provision, protection, and instruction. And it can feel very overwhelming. There can be a lack of justice. There can be a lack of finance. There can be so many different lacks. And then some of that is going to be contingent upon what you've sown. Okay. But I want you to keep in mind that it has to be, remember from last week's teaching, it has to be the perfect circumstance for you to reap. In other words, let's say that a man steals from somebody who, is their friend, right? Let me explain this for a second. So let's say a man steals from his friend, okay? Now, obviously, when he's stolen from his friend, that person is no longer his friend. So now what do we need? We need a new friend to come along and steal from him. Then that circumstance is satisfied. Let's say a man lusts after a married woman, but he himself is not married. Until he is actually married and somebody lusts after his wife, is it complete? Okay. Is it satisfied, satiated? An avenger of blood is content that they no longer have to pursue. And those avengers of blood, that's a very important subject, but not necessarily one we want to pursue today. We may in the Midrash, I don't know. Okay, so what you need to understand is as this dissension is going on, something is happening to the mind, the body, and the soul. The mind is starting to panic. There is no protection, there is no provision, there is no instruction. God has become completely silent. God has taken away, and these are words that people say, God has stopped talking to me. I can't hear him anymore. God took away my blessing. And often I hear, I just want to die. I just feel like I want to end it all. I don't understand my purpose. I don't want to be here anymore, etc., etc. All wilderness season speech prior to the halfway point. So then what we encounter is something different, right? Now, in fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to change this up a little bit. Let's see. Let's just go ahead and do this. We'll just get rid of that and this. All right. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and illustrate this in terms of descension versus ascension, and we're going to kind of color code them. So in this case, what we've got, what we need to use is a dark color that kind of indicates the descension. Got the wrong one there. There we go. All right. And so that is obviously going to be here. Okay. All right. So then the second part of this is going to be the ascension part. And the ascension part is going up, heading towards what? Mount Sinai, which has a few different significant parts to it. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and use a different color here for this one. Oh, hmm. They are not. Is it not a different shade? Oh, okay. Different shade. There we go. Okay. And so the ascension part has to do with what? The provision, protection, and instruction beginning to be reapplied, climaxing at Pentecost. Provision, protection, and instruction being absolute at Pentecost, but being very diminished and trickling here down by our 25. Now, on the other side of this, we have a spiritual ascension occurring. Why? Because those who respond to the wilderness season correctly will invariably start to understand a deeper wisdom. And that halfway point here is designed as a check and balance. Why? Because as you become more spiritually elite in wisdom and revelation, etc., you start to have an ego trip. That ego trip is a dangerous thing. And so there's a check and balance there. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. And so now we have on the other side of this thing a descension in spiritual process, which means what? The halfway point is a climax right here. There is a climax of spiritual there's a climax right here of spiritual energy occurring, and that is going to be very important in our discussion here in a minute. But what you need to understand is that that will be deep revelation, vibration, frequency, all of the things that are involved with the supernatural realm of energies, right? Not height, width, depth, time. So the relevance here is going to be what happens as you begin to move towards Pentecost. Well, a balance of the physical realm and the spiritual realm occur. People think, oh, well, this dissension means that I am actually becoming more spiritually hungry, more destitute spiritually than before. And that's actually not the case. Let me explain. So what's happening is you retain your learnings, right? Your revelation should go up, 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 up. In revelation, I mean, like things just get deep, wisdom, whatever. I mean, discussions with people and spiritual energy that you experience and all these special things. And all of a sudden there starts to be this reduction in it. But what people don't realize is the reason for that is more of a connecting between the supernatural and the natural. And so Pentecost is perfectly balanced, not only in the sense that it brings both the physical and the spiritual realm into process, but you need to also keep in mind it says that God came down to meet with them on the mountain. And so the premise is that there is actually going to be a there's going to be a convening between the Elohim and the physical realm. Now, why is that important? Because the actual legitimate meeting time is the perfect scenario in which now there's a presentation of the intensification of all power in the universe, not this high and mighty thing, but something that has come down, descended on behalf of those who have not yet ascended, right? Remember, you have to descend in order for someone to ascend. Okay, and so in that process, that's the principle of the death, burial, and resurrection. So when we're talking about this process, one of the things we need to think about is the premise that there is this force pressing in towards Pentecost, and there's a need to bring the Elohim down to the physical realm, but there's a need to elevate the son of Adam, okay? We're going to get into this in a minute, but the principle is that heaven and earth are going to come together at Pentecost. And so don't think that what's happening in this moment heading downward is actually a thing that is not great. And don't think that it's going to feel like hunger like it does down here. You will be satiated sufficiently to understand that you need to bring it down and you need to bring it up. You need to connect the two in order for there to be a betrothal and an acceptance of that betrothal. Okay, so that is just one foundational piece that we needed to establish, this ascension versus descension. Okay, and the premise in ascension versus descension is going to come into play here later on as we discuss terminology. If we're able to get to that point, because there's a number of other things we need to bring up, and we just got to kind of go with the flow here. All right, so now there is one other thing that we need to put in place here, and that is some names. Okay, so we're going to put some names here. So the first name that I want to put here, and I'm just going to put this in yellow. The first name that I want to put here is going to be hover. Okay. So that's number one. Number two is going to be flood. Okay. Number three is going to be Meriba. I actually believe there's two B's in that. Let me go ahead and leave it like that, though. Okay, Meriba. And then there is going to be another one, which is going to be walking upon. And then finally, living. Okay, so those words right there are kind of words that we need to talk about. And I'm putting these up here because you kind of need the checklist, okay? So the first thing that we're going to talk about is going to be the word hover, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and, so we're going to talk about hover first. So when we're talking about hover, where are we dealing with hover? We are dealing with hover in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. So let's go ahead and we will jump over to the tablet and we will take a look at this Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Breshit, the first section of Torah, and we're dealing with this, and God completeth by this. Okay, that's chapter 2. And the earth hath existed waste and void, and darkness is on the face of the deep, and the spirit of Elohim fluttering on the face of the waters. We need that word, fluttering, right? And we're reading off the Young's literal, but that's fine. Okay, and so what we're looking for very specifically is this word moved, right? This is rachaf, okay? Rachaf. And it is literally used only 3 times in Torah. Okay, actually, hold on one second. We're having that technical issue again here. And I'm not quite sure why it keeps want to do this. Okay, so I'm going to have to document it on the board, which is fine. We can do that. But for those of you who are following along with the Blue Letter Bible, again, with this new tablet, something is making it to where it doesn't want to actually give me a legitimate HDMI signal. I'm not quite sure why that is. And so let's see, I'm going to go ahead and give you this word on the board. So the Hebrew word, and now let's see, I want to make sure we've got the right color going here. Let's do this. The Hebrew word is actually rachaf. Rachaf. Okay, and it's going to be a final pay like that. Okay, rachaf. And it's only used 3 times in all of the King James Version of the Bible. Now, what does that mean? That means that what it's been defined as does not necessarily jive. Okay. And so let me give you an example of this. The word rachaf itself is actually only mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Okay. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 11. Okay. And in Jeremiah 23:9. Jeremiah 23:9. Okay. Now, the reason why that's important is because number one, how it's being interpreted has to kind of fit the context of all 3 of those verses. So, for example, if we were to go over to Jeremiah 23:9, and again, I can't share my screen with you, but we can head over there and then we can work through that verse and try to understand what its context is, right? So Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 9, chapter 23, verse 9, and it says, in reference to the prophets, broken hath been my heart in my midst. Fluttered have all my bones. I have been as a man, a drunkard, as a man. Wine hath passed over him, because Yahweh and of his holy words. Okay, so let's bring that into the NLT, and I will read it to you again. It says, my heart is broken because of the false prophets, and my bones tremble. Tremble. Okay, so we're going to talk about trembling here, but we're just going to go ahead and document what we've discovered is that this word is the concept of trembling, or at least that's what's being presented in the King James Version, is the idea of trembling. Okay, so now we're going to go tremble. Tremble. Okay. Now going to Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 11 is going to be our next verse. Chapter 32, verse 11. And this is what it's going to say in the NLT. Like an eagle that rouses her chick and hovers over her young, so he spread his wings to take them up and carried them to safety on his pinions. Okay. And so now all of a sudden we have this kind of this idea of wings hovering. Okay. That's it. That's what we've got so far. Now, then what we've got going on is this premise of what? Hovering here. However, here's the problem. First of all, let's go ahead and address this issue real quick. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? That's how it reads in the English. The earth was void and without form, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. That's kind of our Genesis English, right? So what we have here is we have a problem, and that is that water just seems to exist. Whether the earth is void or without form or not is irrelevant. Water just exists. The deep exists. Okay. So we're not going to get too caught up in that at the moment, but later on, we're probably going to need to process it. Anyways, the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. Okay, so the Spirit of God also is present in this whole scheme of things. So we have an earth without void and without form. We have a deep, or what's known as the tehom, which is another Hebrew word that people don't actually know what it means versus what it means. And then, of course, we have what? We have the spirit or ruach hovering over the face of the waters. Okay. So, of course, obviously, instantaneously, we kind of picture the Spirit of God actually in some sort of cloud-like form, or maybe even we've have the nerve to assign it a dove flying over an endless ocean without land, right? Okay. Obviously, we've got some issues here. Okay. So the first one, and I think it's an important one, is to ask some significant questions. For example, Yeshua is talking to the lady at the woman at the well, right? And as he's talking to her, she's talking about our fathers used to worship on this mountain. You Jews worship in Jerusalem. Which is the more better one? Is it where Jacob worshiped, or is it where you worship in Jerusalem? And who gets to decide that? And Yeshua's like, hey, you're missing the point here, because God is spirit. God is spirit. And that is what? That is not a physical place, right? And then in addition to that, it says there will come a time when all will worship in spirit and in truth. Okay, well, there's already a bunch of questions. For example, how do you worship in truth? Don't think you know the answer, because you don't. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to ask, okay, Yeshua's talking to this woman. He's not speaking in Greek, but it's written in Greek. So we need to kind of ask the question, what was that Greek word representing? So in order to do that, we will go ahead and we will go to those verses, and I will read them to you and document what we need to document, because obviously we still don't have access to the tablet. So going over to John, the book of John, chapter 4, it says that Yeshua was talking to this woman, and in verse 21, it says, Jesus replied, "Believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very, very little about the one you worship, while the Jews know all about him, for salvation comes through the Jews." We won't get into that today. But the time is coming, indeed, is here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. So all I'm going to do is just going to jump over to the interlinear. For those of you who have the Blue Letter Bible, you know how to do this. And I'm going to the interlinear, and very specifically, I'm going to jump over to that word spirit, which of course you guys know is pneuma, right? Pneuma.
Strong's G 4151. Pneuma. Pneuma.
Okay. And so pneuma is Strong's G 4151. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to scroll down, and I know you guys can't see this. I'm going to scroll down, and specifically, I'm going to look at the part that says concordance results shown using the NLT. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to the LXX Greek concordance. What is that? That is going to be where the word pneuma is used in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. So very specifically, we're going to Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 is the first usage of this word. Second usage is in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. Okay. And then, of course, Genesis chapter 6, verse 17. Well, all of these have to do with the word ruach in the Hebrew. And so literally, if we were to take and put the Greek back into Yeshua's mouth as Hebrew as he would have been speaking to the woman, right, to the Samaritan woman, then we know that he would have either been speaking Aramaic or Hebrew, but most likely Hebrew, because obviously Aramaic was more of a trade language of that time and was not necessarily the common language of the Jews. It might have been the common language of the Samaritans, though, so he may have been using Aramaic. But let's say that he actually was using Hebrew, and perhaps maybe the reason he was is because of the fact of such an ancient mystery that was actually being spoken here, because he's literally saying that the intensification of all power in the universe is spirit, ruach, okay? And we're going to get to that in a minute. That's going to be very important in a minute. But what's more important is the fact that when the Jews, okay, so you guys know that after Alexander the Great conquered the known world and died, that his generals kind of carved up his legacy and assigned themselves and fought with each other and finally established lands that they considered were theirs. Well, Ptolemy, one of his generals, actually established the land, as it were, of Alexandria, or the land of Egypt, the land of Syria, the land of Israel, and the land of Libya, etc., all the way around to Morocco, right? That was all Ptolemy's land. So Ptolemy then what? He conquers the Jews, he conquers the lands. His son, Ptolemy Philadelphia, is more of a scholar than he was a man of war. So as his father is diminishing in power and he's rising in power, he builds this library of Alexandria, right? And Alexandria, of course, is this place of learning and all kinds of forums of discussion, like this huge midrash, if you were. Well, at any rate, then he assigns the librarian the task of finding all the wisdom in the entire world and bringing it to this library. It was going to be a central place where every single last documented wisdom could be found. And of course, he says, "Hey, look, I found this. I found these people. They're right here in your kingdom. They have probably the most profound wisdom I've ever heard of." Well, in that process, of course, then he's like, well, I can't speak that language. And of course, the servant's like, well, the easy way to do this is just to have them interpret, right, that language into Greek, and then you will be able to read it. So the Jews agree to it, and they do interpret the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im and Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings into into Greek from Hebrew. And in that process, of course, they're using these words to try to describe, they're using linear logic language communication to describe block logic language communication. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is an entire philosophy behind the Greek language, and that grammar plays a role in that philosophy. We're going to get to that in a minute. But the premise is that what you specifically need to know is that pneuma is air. Okay? Pneuma is air. And what we really need to understand is that they did not have a way to identify molecular structures. They didn't know what air was, right? It's one of the elements. Of course, Aristotle is the one who presented that air had some sort of substance to it, some sort of spiritual substance to it. We're not going to get too much into that. But the premise is that that's what the Jews chose to describe the Ruach, or Ruach. I shouldn't say the Ruach. We're not necessarily needing a definite article there. We're just discussing the concept of the word, right? And of course, we know that that has to do with what? With the idea of the man being outside the tent following a prescribed path, right? So the principle is he goes out and he has this routine. And of course, man noticed that the wind follows a routine, right? Follows a prescribed path. And of course, they knew nothing about the jet streams. They knew nothing about any of the other stuff that is present in the scientific processes that later on prove these words. Okay. All right. So now the premise is that we need to accept that when he says we will worship because God is spirit, we will worship him in spirit and in truth. First of all, you need to understand your concept of spirit is all screwed up. Okay. You need to understand that the moment that somebody positioned the spirit as a person of a triune God, we polytheized, right? We polytheized the intensification of all power in the universe into three gods. Three. Get that finger up. Three gods. And what's important about that is then you need to understand that there's also this function of separation as a result of that. But Yeshua doesn't say that. Yeshua does not ever separate those out. Okay. He just flat out says, we will worship in spirit and we will worship in truth. Well, there's going to be an importance with this in a minute. Okay. So now what we need to accept as a premise is that Ruach is not air, but it is what the Jews decided to try to help Ptolemy understand the wisdom of the Ruach as. Why? Because air is the only element that occupies everything unless it is restrained. What do I mean by that? You can have an airtight container, but the truth is that air is everywhere. And there's a reason why we can say that, and it's not something that people would completely understand. Okay? So, having said that, now it's important to understand that we need to remember that the words in Torah are not English. Just because you have an English version of Torah in front of you, you need to understand the people who translated that into English, whether it be the JPS, right, the Jewish Publication Society, or whether it be Harcourt, or whether it be Zondervan, you need to understand that that's not Hebrew. It's not. It cannot be Hebrew. So that is going to kind of bring us to the question of hover, right? So the question of hover is where does it fit into this rachaf, right? Rachaf, which is kind of this seems to have kind of wings to it, right? But then this talking about Jeremiah talking about his bones trembling. Okay, so let's just for a moment understand, what does it mean for a bone to tremble? We're not going to get into the Hebrew word bone. So let's just kind of go with the idea that this is some inner vibration that's occurring, right? If his bones are trembling, and it seems to be something to do with zeal, right? Because we have that idea of him being caught up in the concept of the false prophets causing him to be in a certain state. Now, we could very easily say that Jeremiah's ego was being attacked and his wounds were kind of causing him to be reactive to people who clearly did not have the process of Elohim occurring in them, but claimed to have it. This is that concept of a false prophet. Well, we need to obviously define false prophet, but again, that would be for another discussion, which I'm sure there's plenty of videos that I've already made about false prophets that you could go back and watch. But the premise is, in short, is that his bones were trembling or vibrating. And the reason why I use vibration is because whether he's shivering out of fear, which is very possible, shivering out of cold because he was thrown in a well, or he is actual vibration is raised as a result of a necessity for that to be the level at which he's vibrating in that frequency in order for there to be a legitimate process between Elohim and human. Okay. Regardless of how it works out, the one that doesn't fit is the bones, right? We can see some sort of fluttering of the spirit over the waters. Okay, some cloud type of thing that's God, and he's seeing the infinite waters without any structure. We could go with that. But the one that doesn't fall into place is the trembling, because why? The second verse is in Deuteronomy chapter 32, and chapter 32 is what? It is the song of Moses. In fact, some of the most amazing prophetic elements of Israel is present in the Song of Moses. And so when we're talking about Deuteronomy 32:11, we are very, very close to the part that talks about false Elohim. That's going to play a role later on. We're not going to get into that yet. Okay, so now you see we've got hovering taken care of. So let's go back to our other screen here, and we're going to go to the flood. And the flood's going to be a lot easier to cover. That concept is going to be a lot easier to cover. So let's jump back to the board. And of course, we're dealing with flood, right? And what's important, so I'm just going to go ahead and put a checkbox here. We took care of hover. Now we're talking about flood. So what's important is the reason why flood needs to be mentioned is because why? It is actually embodying this section of time. Okay. Not necessarily right at Passover and not necessarily right at Tabernacles, but the feast day season is contained within the flood season, right? Flood. And so what does that mean? That means that there's an underlying theme in the feast days. That's all we need to know about flood. All right, let's talk about Meribah. Meribah is the midway point in the process of the Israelites moving to Mount Sinai, in which they said, God brought us out here in the wilderness to die. We have no water. And what? Moses strikes the rock and water comes out. So Meribah is important because the waters of Meribah play a significant role in the history of Israel. Best way I could put it to you is anybody who was at the waters of Meribah and cursed God at that time by saying, God brought us out here in the wilderness to die, according to Psalm chapter 77 and Psalm 95, Yahweh swore in his wrath, which is something we would probably need to study out as well. But Yahweh swore in his wrath that they, who? The ones who were present at the waters of Meribah, would not enter his rest, which is definitely the word Sabbath in the discussion in Hebrews. And so in that sense, we need to understand that there was something significant that happened at the waters of Meribah that eventually equated to him being angry with that generation for 40 years. What does that mean? That means they did not condemn themselves when they refused to go into the promised land. They condemned themselves at the waters of Meribah. That's very important. In fact, the waters of Meribah is a very, 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 very important mystery, because it basically says that even when these people arrived at Mount Sinai, were given the opportunity of covenant, were given the opportunity of betrothal, and went through all the processes, the golden calf, all that stuff, they were never going to enter the promised land. They were actually never going to be the ones to see Abraham's promise come into fruition. Now, there's a reason why that's so important. The first one is that obviously, remember that prophecy is cyclical, okay? And so remember that the waters of Meribah repeat themselves. How do we know that? Where did Moses eliminate his ability to go into the promised land? The second time they arrived at Meribah, he was told to speak to the rock, struck the rock, waters of Meribah, and that guy does not get to go in. Now, there is some powerful stuff there. Waters of Meribah have something to do with the way you react to the wilderness season. And Moses, the greatest of prophets, the writer of Torah, the one where Yahweh spoke mouth to mouth, right? Mouth to mouth, not face to face. That's not what it says. It says mouth to mouth in the Hebrew. In other words, what Yahweh spoke, Moses was speaking at the same time. They were echad. They were one in their process. Meaning what? Meaning that even though you write the entire Torah, which is the word of God, you still don't get to go in the promised land because you blow it in waters of Meribah. My head explodes when I think about that. Now, the reason why Meribah is important is because obviously that's the halfway point between the physical descension and ascension, right? And so what comes right after Meribah? Boom, strike the rock, water comes out. That rock and water never leave the Israelites again. They are provided with water all the way through. In fact, I believe it's the Midrash Rabbah, or it might be some other Jewish folklore, the rock actually followed them. And that jives with what Yeshua said, or what Paul says. He says that Yeshua was the rock that was actually following him. We won't get into that because there's still something that people don't understand about the Yeshua principle, and there's still something that people don't understand about the level at which Yeshua was operating from. Okay, so now what we need to do is move on to our next word, and our next word is walk upon. And of course, this is obviously the part where Peter walks upon the water. Okay. And what's interesting about this is as we're thinking about this process, we need to understand that this water, as it were, has already been demonstrated to have some very interesting attributes to it. We're going to get to that. But walking upon it is a violation of everything that you understand right now about the physical realm, and a violation of everything you understand about the supernatural realm, and the concept of those two actually becoming one. Okay. So short version is no matter how you spin it, it is impossible for a human to walk on water. So either this specific story is a gloss or a lie, or we can identify that there's something else going on that we don't understand anymore, and that obviously has nothing to do with your version of Christianity that you grew up in, or that you are involved in now, or that you came out of. Simple as that. There is no way right now that you could prove to me that a man can walk on water beyond just the faith and belief that the gospel is true. That's it. That's all you've got going for you. There's no actual way to physically explain that process. It wasn't ice. He didn't have floating sandals. It flat out says he walked on water, and there's a moment when he sinks into the water as a result of a certain process, which we may or may not touch upon today. Okay, so walking upon water is in its simplicity just impossible, and therefore not plausible, not acceptable as truth until we understand it better. Okay? And the reason why we're just going to throw it out is because you just can't do it today. It's not provable. Okay? And so we can either just accept that they had special abilities and they deserved special treatment and all this other stuff, which does not equate to a just God. And also that means that you can't actually learn the teachings of Christ and apply them. because you need to understand what they were learning and understanding was very different than the way you're operating today in Christianity. Okay. And for those of you who actually aren't in Christianity, who actually have either rejected it because you don't believe it, and maybe you went through some bad stuff and therefore you're traumatized, and so you hate Christians, or maybe you're an atheist, you need to really listen to what I just said. There is no plausible proof that people walk on water. It's impossible. There's no function of it being possible. We can find the weird red bacteria in Egypt and try to identify that that's what it meant by water turning to blood, because the word blood also doubled as the word red, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can explain so many things away. We can explain the really strong wind moving water away from and causing a dry land to occur. All those things, we can say that when they went through the Sea of Reeds, which is actually this shallow area. You can do all that, but you cannot explain walking on water. You can't. With science, you can't. Okay, so that's very important as we get into this discussion. By the way, this is still foundations. All right, now, next thing we need to talk about is living. What is living? Let's look at the board real quick. What is living? Oh, let's put our check marks here. So we've talked about the flood. We've talked about Meribah. We've talked about walking upon water. And now we are at living water. Okay, living water. So, first of all, what you think you understand about the word life, and what you think you understand about the word eternal, and what you think you understand about what Yeshua is talking about when he says, "Come unto me and I will give you living water." He says it to the woman at the well, and he also says it to the people in the crowd during his 4 days of examination during Watch the Lamb season, right? So let me remind you of how that went. In its simplicity, basically, Yeshua comes into the city of Jerusalem on the 10th day of the first month. And for 4 days, you are supposed to watch the Lamb. And during those 4 days, he's in the temple preaching, and people are starting to call him what? Mashiach, the anointed one. Now, they didn't even really know what that was, because really it was a definition the rabbis had come up with to try to explain this person who was coming, who was going to deliver them from their captivity. And everybody kind of believed that it was going to be a physical deliverance, but the truth is that Yeshua came and he was teaching about ascension, descension. He was teaching about the higher self and the strong mind and all of the other things that we've covered in the past and talked about. He was teaching about the Christ consciousness, as it were. He was teaching about the Elohim within you. Okay. All right, so now it is very important that we understand that there is a concept here where he says living waters. He says, "Come to me and I will give you living waters and you will thirst no more." Well, what's interesting about that is what the people would have understood about living waters. Behind me, you see there's actually, and I'll move this so you can see it even better, there is a mikvah pool behind me. And the premise behind a mikvah pool was that you would disrobe yourself and be in the nude, and you would enter the mikvah pool and you would completely immerse yourself. In fact, the Hebrew word for baptism, or baptismos, which is the Greek word, is actually mikvah. Now, that word is going to become important because why? Because when it says, "Let the waters be gathered into one place" in Genesis chapter 1, it's using the word mikvah. And when Jeremiah says, "I will give you hope," it uses the word mikvah. And so mikvah doubles as the word hope and as the word as a gathering of waters. That may or may not be relevant to our discussion, but it would definitely be something interesting we bring up in Midrash. Now, the next thing that we need to look at, and the principle is that we need to understand that Mayim Chaim had to do with the filtration process of the mikvah. So I'm going to try to illustrate for you a crude Talmudic definition of the word mikvah, okay? So let's jump back over to our board, and let's just go over here, and we are going to just have this kind of this steps going down into the water. Let's go ahead and create some structure here, right? And so now let's see. Let's let's do some water here. Okay. Now the deal is that, and this is important, the technology for this did not exist. The technology for this did not exist before Roman aquifers. Okay. But the principle is that right here, how am I going to do this? Let's do this way. Let's just color this dark blue. Okay, right here on each side was an inlet and an outlet for a Roman aquifer flowing system. This literally is flowing or running water, real running water in this ancient time of Yeshua. And the way that it would work is that basically there was a Roman aquifer fill system that would overflow. And as it overflowed, water would flow down into, and there would be a current, as it were, that was created. Okay. And then it would flow out this and downhill again. And so the premise is that a Roman aquifer would force the water into the mikveh. The water would overflow and flow through this little hole. And then there was a little hole at the other side where it would overflow and it would flow downhill, creating kind of a siphon system. Well, why was that important? The reason that was important is because without that system in place, the water would become unclean. Why? Because it could grow mold. Okay. It could grow moldy. And mold, as we know, is unclean. So I'm just going to kind of illustrate some mold here. So the premise is that a mikveh pool had to have actual flowing water, and that idiom was called mayim vayim. Okay, and the reason why that is important is because in the English, we actually call that living waters. Ma'im Chaim is going to be living waters. Okay. And so in principle, then now we have kind of this idea where living waters or Ma'im Chaim now makes a little bit more sense and how the people would have understood it in ancient times. Because why? Because this is what was in the temple. This was the way in which a person who had been exposed to uncleanness could come in and be completely immersed under the water that was what? Flowing in spirals around him as a result of this forced inlet and this siphoned outlet. Okay. The principle of fluid dynamics occurring here, which we're going to get to in a minute. Okay. Now, there is now a need to understand that concept in a deeper way. All right, so let's see. We have gotten through our list here of hover, flood, meriba, walk upon, living. And obviously by now you have begun to understand that we are going to be talking about water. But there's one more very important thing we need to talk about, and that is going to be grammar. Okay. Remember, I said language and culture are intimately connected with each other. So what we need to do is we need to talk about the English language right now, okay? And we need to talk about we need to talk about linguistic grammar rules. So, for example, in Hebrew and in some other cultures, Latin cultures, etc., we have a very interesting way in which they communicate in that um, they will say uh, verb, subject, object, adjective. Okay. Now, in our language, we will say subject, verb, adjective, object. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, subject, the quick brown fox jumped over the ugly log. Okay. So in Hebrew and certain Latin and some Slavic languages, it says jumped over the log, the quick brown fox. I'm sorry, jumped the quick brown fox over the log ugly. Okay. Now, in Aramaic and in Arabic languages, this shows to be the Middle Eastern style of speaking. However, some intrigue exists here because the more ancient language, which is Proto-Indo-European, seems to follow this structure of grammar. What does that mean? That means that languages that predate Arabic, Aramaic, and some of the other uh, um, Middle Eastern dialects follows a different verb structure. So ancient researchers of languages have actually identified that it is very possible that Hebrew followed the English grammar. Well, this could become very important in the process if we were going to be interpreting scripture. So, how does Genesis chapter 1 read in the English? In the English, following the Proto Indo European language, which predates English, right? It was kind of the it's the foundation of English. We encounter, and this doesn't listen, this isn't statically just 100% black and white. I want you to know that. So when I'm speaking about this, please understand it's kind of the majority of that grammar seems to follow that role. Okay. So in Genesis chapter 1, in the English, reading out of the NLT, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay. So obviously, right off the bat, then we have some instantaneous things happen in our head. Instantaneously, we look at in the beginning as the start of something. When actually, in the Hebrew, there is no definite article. It does not actually say in beginning. Furthermore, this is an absolutely idiomatic interpretation of the word Rosh. Okay. The word Rosh in the Hebrew means head, but very specifically, Rosh had to do with the chieftain or the clan leader. Okay. And the reason why this is important is because the word Bereshit in the Hebrew is interpreted as in the beginning when actually there is no definite article present. There could be, but there's no proof that it was there beyond what the Mazors did to put an actual definite article there. Okay. Now, there's a few reasons why this is important, but the biggest reason is that following the actual verb, subject, object, adjective process, we would read this very differently. In the Hebrew, this is how it actually reads following that process. It says, Breshit, which is a combination of Reshit and Beh being in, right? And then Reshit being what? I'm sorry, I said earlier the Mazars put in a definite article. They didn't put in a definite article. That's right. So, anyways, Bereshit is a combination of Bet and Reshit. Reshit is an actual it's an actual identification as the top of something or the summit of something, the summit of a mountain, right? Which moves us in a direction of something different than a time period. Okay, so let's let go of time. Stop thinking in terms of this is actually when time began, and here's the process. Okay, it says Breshit, right? Bara. Now, bara is actually written like this. Now, what you need to know is that is in lexical form. Lexical form actually has something very interesting going on. I'm going to go ahead and change colors for this. Lexical form has, let's do a fatter pen here. Lexical form has first person, which is what? I'm sorry, not first person, third person, third person. Third person, which is what? He or she. Third person, using he or she. Masculine, which means he. Singular, so it's not they. Singular, okay? That is completed or perfect. Completed. I mean, it's finished, right? It is not a promise. It is not an offer. It is done. So quite literally, this is he created, right? He, not they. He created the heavens and the earth, right? That's what it seems to say here. He, not they. Now, there's something very important about that, and that's going to come in the next word. But we're not quite there yet because we need to talk about this word created, which actually literally means to intensify or to fatten. So let's talk about this. What we believe we have seen because we have an English Bible as being in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is now starting to shape into something very, very, very different. And the reason why this is important and the reason why I'm showing you this grammar has to do with the next word. Okay. And so here's how it works. In the current system of Middle Eastern grammar, this is that process. So we could go with in the beginning, we'll just put an X there to represent in the beginning, God, right? Or I'm sorry, in the beginning created God the heavens and the earth, and there is no adjective, right? The heavens and the earth. Now, here's the part that is relevant. When we are talking about this, the actual grammar analysis is important because of this next word, which is what? Elohim. Elohim. Okay? Elohim. And so the premise is that Elohim is pluralized, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But what we really kind of got to get our minds wrapped around is the ancient Hebrew understanding of this word. But it's important because it says he, singular, first or third person, masculine, singular, completed. He created, right? So in beginning, he, singular, Elohim, plural, created the heavens and the earth. Grammar problem in the English, big grammar problem. And I'm going to prove it to you here in a minute. But the premise is that what theologians have concluded is that sometimes Elohim should be interpreted as a singularity or as a non-plural word, and sometimes Elohim should be interpreted as a plural word, and only context will help us understand. Well, I'm here to offer to you, and I can tell you there are a lot of rabbis who will back me up on this. That is actually a very important Hebrew word I learned from Rabbi Messer, ba lo ni. Okay? It's baloney. Now, there's a reason why this is important. Because we're taking the first verse of the Bible and realizing it is interpreted incorrectly. But there's a reason why you need to know this today, and that's because of verse 2, and we're going to get to that. Okay? So now the next thing that we need to do is understand that there is a process now that we need to get to make this work. Well, there's only one way to actually do that, and that is to allow, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this over here, and we're going to actually write out this whole thing. So in the Hebrew, let's see, I'm just going to do this real quick, okay? This is going to be Bereshit. I'm just going to make sure that I don't miss any vowel points that may or may not need to be in there. Okay? Right. Yod, very important in this word. Okay? Bereshit, and then what? Bara. Bara. And then what? Elohim. Making sure that I get my vowel points correct. Elohim. Where's the vav for lo? It's not there, right? It's assumed. Okay, and then what? We have it. And then we've got hashamayim. I'll just come down this next line. Hashamayim. Oh. There we go. Mayim. And these are final mems that you're seeing at the end of these. And then we've got ve'et. Ve'et. There's our vav. Ve'et. Haaretz. Ve'et. Haaretz. Sorry. Haaretz. Haaretz. Okay, so a couple things that we have going on already is we have this mess. Oh my goodness, that fell down on the ground. Okay, we have this mess right here, which we need to clear up. And this mess is this here and here, which the way that I want you to think about this is in terms of, okay, so let's say that I have a ball and I throw it to you, okay? And so in the English language, using the verbiage, I would say I threw the ball to you, okay? Now, there are two objects in that. There is a direct object and there is an indirect object. The indirect object is you being thrown to. The ball's going to you. What's the direct object? The object that's actually the verb is happening to, right? The verb is happening to the ball. And so the ball is the direct object. The indirect object is you. Now, the reason that's important is because you're still an object of the verb. It says you're an indirect object. The verb is not happening to you, but the verb is happening with you, right? Okay, that's important. But now what we need to do is say the difference between throwing a ball to you and throwing the ball, right? And the ball would be something unique and important and very different, right, than the rest. That's why we would use the in English. If I threw the ball to you, it was that specific ball, right? It was not a ball, just any general ball. There was the ball. Okay. So obviously, when we get into the context of sports or whatever, the ball is that one specific ball on the playing field. All right. So now, the definite direct object is always identified with an aleph and a tav. In other words, it's unique and it is what the verb is happening to. Okay. That's what these two grammar things are that are never interpreted in English, but that forces us to put a the somewhere. So the scholars say, oh, the goes right here. Well, the problem is there is no the there. In fact, the Mazors put a segel here like this, which is our bereshit, right? That's our be. But the thing is if it was in the beginning, then it would be ba reshit. Okay, it would be in the beginning. It would be Barashit, but it's Bereshit. Okay, that's important for a very relevant reason, and that very relevant reason is we have to have a definite article somewhere. We have to have either a name or we have to have a title in order for those to exist in this sentence. Now, the reason that that's important is because then that forces a grammar change on our situation. We have a plural here, but we do not have a plural verb, which means we cannot use the SOA. We have to use SVO, SVAO, which is the other grammar system. Okay, now there's other grammar systems out there, but the Proto-Indo-European, which is where our Anglo-Saxon language comes from, is actually going to use this set, which means what? Breshit becomes the subject of the verb, which means in beginning is actually a pronoun. So Breshit is a name, or it is an entity of some sort or a title, right? Well, going back to our Rosh, right? We now have this idea of king, or we have this idea of something higher, right? Because of the word Reshit, which is summit. So we could literally say in summit, right? Or it can also be the source of something, not in the sense of time, but in the sense of origin. And so we could literally say source here, but we're not going to force it to be source or summit. We're just going to say that this is some title. So some title of some sort or name. Okay, that's important. So now this starts to possibly make sense because he would be this thing here. So this created this. Well, that's our English word God. And so really this says this created God. Well, that doesn't jive with any theology that I've ever heard of. But the premise is that then we need to figure out Elohim better. Well, in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, Elohim starts with the parent root of what? Of the lead ox, right? Oh, goodness, that's a fat nose on that guy. The lead ox, right? Which we find this in so many cultures. This right here is so many different cultures. And then, of course, we have the shepherd's crook, which means what? Strong authority. Well, what is authority really? Authority is the actual privilege. That's a crazy way to say it. The privilege of having the ability to move something or tell something to move or tell something to do something. Okay. And so strong authority is the ability to tell something to move or do something. Okay. Not the ability, the privilege, the privilege. In other words, it has to be granted by something else. Okay. So now that starts to make a little bit of sense that Elohim kind of plays this role in plural because there are more than one thing going to follow in this creation process. So literally, the way that this actually reads is this thing, this title or name, is a masculine principle or a masculine name or title creates Elohim. What Elohim? The heavens and the earth, meaning the heavens and the earth are actually Elohim. They are actually gods. I know that just hit in a way it shouldn't have, because now all of a sudden I have completely disintegrated your creation process of how you've understood it in the past. But there's a reason why I'm getting to this, okay? And that is going to come in the form of two very important aspects. Number one, this right here is the word water. And this right here is the word land. And there is nothing else. And you say, wait a minute, why do you say that? Why is the Hashamayim, why do you say that about the water? Well, literally what it says is the two waters, right? The two waters. That's the principle of the word Hashamayim or heaven. Very different take on this, different understanding on this, a very different process on this. Okay. So now the next thing that we need to do, now that we've kind of broken this down, so because we need to give some sort of title or name, I'm not trying to assign anything here, but because we need to kind of straighten out this sentence a little bit, I'm going to call this source. Okay. And so here is how it is actually going to read. What I'm going to do is go ahead, shrink this down, move it over here, and then I'm going to actually write out this sentence. And so the way that this is actually going to read, and I'm going to write it in something that we can clearly see, is, in source, he created the Elohim, heaven, heaven and earth. Okay, so here's the intrigue. In the beginning, right? God created the heavens and the earth. No, this is actually somewhat how it should read, because the grammar doesn't jive. The interpreters did the best they could, but there was something they were missing and didn't understand, is that this is not the word God. This is not the German word for a creator entity. It's not. It means powers. Powers, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Powers. Or specifically strong authority. Okay. So now obviously you're like, okay, you lost me, whatever. Okay. I know that that's going to be difficult, but then we're going to kind of muddy the waters a little bit more. And I apologize for that, but we got to go through this. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 9. And I'm reading out of the NLT. And again, I apologize that I can't actually share that screen with you. I'm going to get that fixed, I promise you. Then God said, let the waters beneath the sky flow together into one place so dry ground may appear. And that is what happened. Okay, first of all, what we need to do is we need to deal with this idea of waters, but I'm going to keep reading. Next, we have God called the dry ground land and the waters seas, and he saw that it was good. Okay, so now we call it sea. Okay, keep that in mind. So I'm just going to put sea up here, and I'm going to put it in big because it's about to be in your face. Remember, that is what he called the gathered waters. Sea. Okay. Then what happens? It goes down to what? It goes down to verse 20, and it says, then God said, let the waters swarm with fish and other life. Let the skies be filled with birds of every kind. Okay, before we get any further, there's a couple things that you need to know. The first one is that the word sky there is actually Hashamayim. And that the word waters there is Mayim. Okay, so when we talk about and God said, we've got to go back into our grammar, and I'm not going to put that one up on the board, but what it really says is, and he said, Elohim, waters become fish, okay, or bring forth or birth fish. Now, the reason why this is important is because now all of a sudden we have what? Source speaking to the Elohim water. In other words, water is an Elohim. Now, we could get weird with this and say water is a god, right? Because that's how you would interpret in the English. But remember, we're trying to avoid the English here because that gets us in a really weird position in our head. So let's see if we can't just leave it as water is a power, okay? And water is powers, more than one, right? A plural power, right? Okay. Now there's a reason why this is important, and you don't want to miss it. He tells water to make fish. So the whole time, Source is telling these different Elohims to do things. He tells earth, bring forth seed yielding, or tree with fruit yielding seed, right? Tells the earth to do it because the earth is an Elohim. Remember from our whole interpretation here, earth is an Elohim, okay? Because why? He created it. Source created Elohim, the heavens, and Elohim, the earth. Okay. In other words, he created Elohim. What Elohim? The heavens and the earth. Then it says, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Well, it doesn't necessarily say he was hovering over the waters. In verse 2, it actually reads in the Hebrew, al pinei tehom ruach, right? And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the, I'm sorry, Elohim mirchafet was hovering, no, is hovering. In the Hebrew, this is actually, and again, this is where it kind of a bummer that I can't actually show you this, but that it is actually a participle that's active. The ruach is hovering over the still. That it's not completed action. So it literally says, and was hovering over the waters. In fact, I'll read to you the Young's literal, because remember, the Young's literal does not do any English jive to try to manipulate the sound, or I'm sorry, manipulate the sentencing. The earth hath existed, waste and void. Not the earth was without form, but the earth has existed as waste and void, and darkness is on the face of the deep. And the Ruach of Elohim is fluttering on the face of the waters. So now all of a sudden, what do we have? We have present tense right now in this moment in height, width, depth, time. The Ruach is still Rachaf, vibrating. But now I'm going to take it a step further. When we look at this word all in the Hebrew, all, it does not mean upon, but means to go up, which means what? The Ruach is increasing the vibration of the waters. Okay, so then what do we have? We have a constant process of water here. We have water from mikvah, right? Which the greatest version of that is that story of Naaman, the man who actually came from the Assyrian army and actually dips 7 times in the Jordan to what? To be cleansed. And so literally this concept that we have going on is that water has an ability to do something other than what the natural order scientific processes claim. Okay, so we're going to get to that in a minute. But the premise is what we have in front of us right now is that water is an Elohim. It is actually a power that in the English could be translated as water god. Okay. Why is that important? Because when we talk about source telling these Elohims to do these things, it is very easy to try to get caught up in some anthropomorphic council of gods. But it is also very dangerous to pass over the fact that there is actually some energy or power of creative ability inside of earth, inside of sky, inside of water, right? We are starting to get into this idea that there is actually supernatural energy and power present in these things. Because source, he tells the Elohim earth to bring forth trees bearing fruit, or fruitful trees bearing seed. Okay, so the principle is that earth out of the nothing creates trees. Okay, so our brains are going to instantaneously say that earth is dirt, but that's not necessarily the case, because look at things like, for example, cryptogamic soil. Cryptogamic soil is a soil that has a process of growth that is so slow that it's actually over thousands of years. Alaskan tundra or Arctic tundra is very similar in that its expansion is very, very, very slow. Excuse me. And so now what we need to do is begin to accept that what we thought we saw in the 7 days of creation has something else going on with it. So here is the part where we start to get into some complications, okay? Because in verse in verse 10, it says, "And God called the dry land earth, and to the collection of waters he hath called seas, and God seeth that it is good. Now, I'm going to just explain this to you in such a way that is going to make it a little bit more difficult, and that is that you have to take the verb and accept, because I can't show you, that it is in the singular. But then the subject, supposedly the subject, is in the plural. And we do not have any distinction between those two to accept that there's some sort of grammar where we can make a plural word a singular word, except in the false and heretical doctrine of the Trinity. In other words, the only way that you can make this jive is to try to have three gods claiming that they're somehow one and have that not be polytheism, which is probably one of the biggest reasons Jews do not believe in Yeshua. Now, as we continue, now I'm going to read verse 10 to you, so follow along in your Bible, and I'll show you how different it actually is. And he called, who? Source. Elohim Aretz, right? Elohim Aretz, right? And he called Mikvah Yam. Okay, I'm going to get the Yam in a minute. And Elohim seeth that it is good. No, it says, and he, who? Source, saw that Elohim was, that Elohim, what? The earth and the seas were Tov. He saw it, right? The source saw that the Elohim of earth and the Elohim of seas, or the earth god and the sea god, were good. The only reason I'm throwing God in there is so that you can understand the level of power that these entities actually have. They're not intelligent in terms of their being persons, but instead are functions of energy that have extreme power. We're going to get to that. All right. So now, in terms of that, now what we need to do is we need to try to see if there is a place where that grammar makes a transition. Okay. And here is where it makes a transition. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Okay. It says, and he said, right? First person singular, and he said. I'm sorry, not first person, third person singular. And he said, completed action. He already spoke. And he says, Elohim, what Elohim? We'll get to that. Make Adam. But what's interesting is then it says, in our image, right? Now, there would be a potential here to say that this is proof that the word God is actually, the plural God is actually saying that it's in our image in the sense of what that Trinity doctrine presents. Okay. That is far from the case, and I'm about to show you how. All right. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to move forward into this concept or this idea of this word image. Okay. Because one of the problems that we have, listen, you guys know, we hear this all the time in Christianity. We hear this all the time, even not in Christianity, even in weird circles. We are the image of God, right? But we do not understand what that Hebrew word actually means. So I'm going to show you. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a light source, okay? So let's say that we go ahead and I'll do yellow for that, our light source. And I'm just going to be a little bit sarcastic about it, and I'm just going to create a lamp here, and I will go ahead and illustrate that a little bit here. Let's say that we just go with this green for a light bulb, right? And of course, it's not hard to draw a light bulb. Oh, unless, of course, you're okay. And so there's our light bulb. All right. And then for actual light beams, we'll go ahead and use orange. And I will use just a little bit thicker pen for that. And that, of course, is just light source coming out. Okay. So there's our lamp. There's our light source. Now we're just going to go ahead and we're going to put an object in the path here. We're going to take this object and we're going to put it in the path, right? And so what's going to happen in the light? The light, and actually we'll go ahead and make it a solid, right? Which of course is one of many sacred shapes, the cube. And so then what? Now we have, it's blocking light, and therefore now we have what? We have a shadow, right? We have a shadow here. And so we have all of this light all around the cube, right? And the only thing that actually indicates that there is light present with the cube is actually the only thing that's unique in the whole situation is the shadow. This is actually the Hebrew word. I'm trying to write in Hebrew here from left to right. This is actually the Hebrew word tselem, or shadow. So literally this is saying, let us create Adam, our shadow. It's possessive. And here's the part that's crazy about it is that when it says in our image, it's literally let us create Adam in our shadow. Okay, so let's talk a minute about this concept of shadow. All right. So now you see that this concept here of shadow has nothing to do with image. Okay. It has nothing to do with image. It has to do with shadow. And the premise is that it's a place that shows that there's a limitation upon light, that there was some object placed in front of light, preventing light from coming forward. Okay. So now in that principle, then what we need to do is we need to start to understand how that works in the concept of a cosmic being. Okay. Well, obviously, I've explained this a little bit before, but the premise is that basically what we have is we have a, let me see, I think I'm going to use this color for this part. So we have this concept of this idea of this intensification of all power in the universe going off out in every direction. We've talked about that it is actually benevolence, it's love, right? It is a process of desire to give, and it is insatiable. It does not have the ability to prevent itself from doing exactly that, pushing love or benevolence, not malevolence, down in every direction. Okay. And that in and of itself is basically the concept of the intensification of all power in the universe, or what we would call source, or the origin of all things. Okay. Now, that is just a single principle concept of the desire to bestow without any limitation. This is the concept of there being no consent or permission for the source to assert itself upon anything that exists. But here's the problem. Nothing can actually exist except benevolence, love, etc. Okay. So then that process then turns into a desire. And that desire then causes something very interesting to occur. And that is that all of a sudden, out of the middle of nowhere, there is a limitation placed upon it. So let me show you how that works. Then what we have here is we have this, what we're going to call a boundary. Okay. And so let me go ahead and label this as a boundary upon this process. So in the boundary upon the process, what we have here is boundary. Okay. Boundary. There's an A, goes right here. Okay. So now we have a boundary, but we still have the intensification of all power in the universe asserting itself upon this boundary. So the way that we need to illustrate that is to go like this. Okay. These rays are not flowing outward, but are trying to flow into this boundary. Okay. So I'm just going to put arrows showing this source trying to assert benevolence upon this boundary, but this boundary is actually operating outside the realm of that consciousness. What do I mean by that? This boundary is actually its own free will to choose whether to accept or not. Well, doesn't this illustration look familiar? There's literally here no light, no benevolence, no assertion of that principle. This boundary is restraining, right? This boundary is restraining the source from entering this realm, which we'll talk about in a minute. That premise then asserts itself as free will to choose whether to receive, and which makes this what? A reception. Why is that important? Because the reception then says, you know what? I will allow only one in. And you guys know where this is going. You guys know exactly what just happened. This is what? This is now. In fact, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to do this different. I am going to if I can't get a good wrap here. All right. Yes, perfect. Okay. This boundary and free will is then operating in a realm like this. And I am only going to allow in one, right? So all these are asserting themselves. All are trying to get in. All have traveled to get to this specific spot. And what? Only one is allowed in. And so this is what? What is the concept going on here? Conception. Okay. So now we have conception asserting itself as a principle of now there is an allowance of benevolence into what? Womb, which is where what? A bringing forth of seed occurs as a result of seed not being the germinating product that actually causes the fertility, but instead is the offspring of the tree, right? Is the result of the offspring of the tree or fruit. And fruit is being developed within womb, okay? So now you can see that in the original process, source does not have a way to assert benevolence upon anything except itself, which is not all that great of a feeling. Then it creates a boundary that can say no to it. Well, when we talk about source as being um a untethered, we're going to just going to put untethered here, untethered process, we understand it to be masculine in nature. And why do we say that? Because there is actually no reception occurring within source, only inception. Okay. And so I'm just going to write inception across the top of this. Inception. This is the assertion of a first principle. Okay. Now, over here in womb, we have what? We have a concept of there being a change in that process, because now benevolence has been allowed to assert itself and therefore has satisfied its desire to assert itself, but only through consent. See, these concepts are built into a human being. They're built into the conscience. They're built into all aspects of life and of everything else. And so now what's interesting about this is, if this is, and I'm going to try to do this in a different color here and see if I can get away with it. This is Breshit, right? Oh, I really did that, didn't I? So this is Breshit. This is source. This is the foundation. This is well, not necessarily foundation, but this is the origin of all things, the intensification of all power in the universe in a state of inception, not limited, right? Not having any type of definition or limitation upon it. Then creates a limitation or boundary that requires consent for inception to become conception through reception, the receiving of that first principle, of that first, or that acceptance of that. And so what happens, this now in the state of womb, I illustrate one more moment here, because obviously you guys know where this is going. You know that this is actually going to end up there being no more benevolence being sent or bestowed upon this vessel. And I shouldn't use that word yet, but this state of reception is no longer accepting anymore, meaning what? That all that's happening here is the principle of intensification or growth or maturation, right? Pushing out against the limitation. But remember, nothing can be allowed in. That's done. That process is finished. Now something is happening from the inside out. This right here, a vessel of reception that has received the seed and now has the power intensifying within it, is, and here's the kicker, Elohim. Literally a vessel of reception that has received seed and is now intensifying. Now it has the power within itself to do what? To create. So why is this important? Well, obviously two things that we need to keep in mind. The first one is that when we are encountering the word Elohim, we need to stop saying God. Because if we were to accept that this right here is God, then all of this is something created. To accept that to be true. Unfortunately, that gets us to a very interesting concept that Elohim is something else, right? The word Elohim that's being translated in the English as the word God is definitely something else. But remember, my whole discussion is not about this, right? It's about water. And what I really want you, what I want to get your mind wrapped around is what water actually is and how it actually works. And so, in principle, in trying to wrap this into a package you can process, we need to now look at this in terms of the mention of Elohim. So, if we accept the grammar the way that it's supposed to be, then we start to see this concept of being inside of something, which makes total sense now. Adam is created within the shadow, or what? The vessel of reception, but he becomes what? In and of himself, an, an entity that can accept the benevolence from above. However, that's inside of something else. Okay. So, in principle, this is how this works. And I know that this is going to get really, really hairy. So, let's start at the beginning. We have what? We have Hashamayim, or heavens. I'm going to put here sky. Then we have what? We have earth, or dry land, Elohim. And then we have water, Elohim, which is what? Sea, Elohim. Sorry. Right? Because why? Bring forth fish, bring forth trees, bring forth birds. Being commanded by source to do these things. And then we have man, which is what? Shadow, Elohim. Which is what? Proof of the boundary. Meaning what? He's very different from these three. Adam is very different. Whereas these are a height, width, depth, time process, Adam is within the actual first principle, which means what? Adam is actually more powerful than those three. Okay. Now, dry land is told to bring forth beasts of the field, crawling things, right? And hopping things. And what? Adam is told to name them. But in the Hebrew, it says what he named them is what they became, not what they were, not what they were assigned as titles, but what they actually became, which means what? He has the ability to manipulate the actual form of those things that were brought to him. So he operates as in having the ability to manipulate those processes, which means what? He is actually an authority over water, over earth, over heaven. Do we see that in the 66 books compendium that people call the Bible? Do we see a mention of that? What does the disciples say? Who is this man that he even controls what? The wind, right? That he even controls the wind. And here's the part that's crazy is then he turns around and says, y'all don't know what you are. O ye of little faith, how long will I contend with you? How long do I have to try to convince you of this, of who you really are and what you really are? Now, in the realm of height, width, depth, time, the containment action of vessel is the body, but the intensification of power within that vessel is an Elohim. Proof, Psalm chapter 82, where it says what? You are all Elohim or sons of Elohim, right? Which is what? The difference between the authority and the lesser authority. A continued demonstration of greater and lesser, greater and lesser, greater and lesser, greater and lesser. Now, why would that be important? Because now all of a sudden we can understand that water as an Elohim, and I know that I'm doing my scribble thing again, so give me a second to clean this up real quick. Water as an Elohim plays a very, very significant role in Adam's process. How do we know that? Well, let's just look at the science. How does a human exist? How do they go on? How does life occur in a natural order process? Well, in short, in its simplicity, the hydrogen is stripped off of water in a process of glucolysis, which is where basically glucose is split into two molecules. Water hydrogen is added to it, creating a very different thing called adenosine triphosphate. The offspring or the waste material of that is the two oxygen that are left over from the water, which is what? O2. Add one carbon to that, and we've got CO2, which is what we breathe out as a waste product that the Aretz Elohim created as a process for its plants to breathe, creating a cycle, right? A process by which it gives us oxygen, and we in turn give it carbon dioxide. A principle that goes back to that first principle of giving and receiving. But now here's a part that's interesting. In all of that, that's just the height, width, depth, time physiology of the body. We've identified that adenosine triphosphate is the actual energy of life. It's what tells a cell to go through one more cycle of process. And if that cell does not have that present, that cell will die. And once that cell dies, the next cell that doesn't receive it and the next cell that doesn't receive it, it becomes a death across the board. In fact, cancer plays a role in this because obviously cancer doesn't follow the rules that the DNA give it. And since the cancer doesn't follow the rules that the DNA give it, it doesn't follow the rule of how to have that process occur. It steals adenosine triphosphate. It steals energy. And even then, in that process, we think that that is not a spiritual element or process. But now here's the part that's important. Yahweh gave to us, and when I say Yahweh, you now understand that Yahweh is an Elohim, but that Yahweh is a very special kind of Elohim that gives revision, protection, and instruction to the lesser self inside of the what? The shadow. Okay? And so what we need to understand is that when Yahweh gave us instruction to use mayim, water, it had to be living water. It had to be water that was moving. Why? Because it is swirling around you. So as water is moving as a wave and it hits an object, it doesn't stop there. It pushes past it. Meaning what? Water is actually a masculine principle. Here's where this gets interesting. In its simplicity, what water does is it asserts itself upon anything and everything that has the path of least resistance. So the best way I could put it to you is anything that does not tell it no, it pushes through. If I take a bottle of water, if I take my container of water here and I dump it on my tablet, what's going to happen? First of all, it's going to spread out all over my tablet, probably ruin it, maybe not. Technology has gotten better at water, but the premise is I would never get it back in here because it has done what? It has spread out in all directions, just like the intensification of all power in the universe, which means what? Water is a very high level Elohim. Water superseded dry ground. Water superseded the water superseded light, right? Water supersedes so many things, and yet we don't necessarily see a mention of it actually being created, which means what? It is a very high level source Elohim. Now, in this realm of height with depth time, it has corrupted into water molecules, but it's an Elohim that is under the command of the son of Adam or of Adam, meaning that it is very important to understand that what we thought we understood about water is not true. We have been given water to heal, right? We have been given water to be a process of our body. We have been given water to be an action of the water cycle, the rain to water our plants. There we've got the what? The just and unjust, a provision, protection, and instruction from Yahweh Elohim to the just and the unjust. We have the flood, which was an intensification of that Elohim upon the earth to bring about what? Social justice, an equal distribution of justice. Remember, the word judgment means an equal distribution of right treatment to each individual individually as a whole. So when we are looking at water, you need to understand that it has something within it that it gives us the very existence of life, which is why dehydration is so dangerous. But we need to also understand it was given for us to immerse ourselves in, to change the frequency of our process. And one last thing that's very important is that it's dynamic. That is to teach us and give us an understanding of actually how to use the Ruach, or to use the actual air, which is also an Elohim, to heal. And now we get into something very interesting, because now we have water within us, which we know is now an Elohim. We know is something spiritual. We know is not just a combination of oxygen and hydrogen, but has other attributes to it and can exist within the realm of thought. I will prove that in a minute. Can exist within the realm of vibration. I'll prove that in a minute. But the premise is in all of that, it is very important to understand that it is just not a hydration. It is just not an and that's why we call it hydration, by the way, is because that hydrogen molecule is stripped off of the H2O. Okay, and so basically what we have is that concept, or that idea, that the hydrogen is being used, the two hydrogen are being used, the oxygen is released, and the second oxygen is placed in it with a carbon, and that becomes our CO2, which comes out of our body. But it's also important to understand that that's just in height, width, depth, time, which is a very corrupted version of Elohim. Now, in that function and understanding, we need to understand it still has perfection. It still has power. It still has energy. That's why we have proof of energy within plants. The experiment where they had one plant in the room and they had another plant in the room, and the person comes in and they have nodes hooked up to the one plant. A person comes in and just hacks up the other plant, right in front of this plant, and then walks out. They had different researchers go in and study the other plant and write down things, and not one of them caused a reaction. When the person who hacked up the plant walked back into the room, this plant starts going nuts with all of its energy waves. And that was where they hooked up an EKG to a plant. Okay, so a heartbeat thing up to a plant. And this plant knew who killed the other plant. And this plant could recognize the difference between who killed it and who didn't. Okay. In water, there was an identification where basically there was an experiment done where they actually had water that was polluted or water that had been subjected to negative thought, where basically they had shown a person a bunch of negative images that created sadness or anger or anxiety, and they had basically a way in which the water was flowing around the person, and then they tested that water as it was being frozen into crystalline structure, and it was actually chaotic and didn't have any order to it. But then when they actually had water come in and actually be part of a positive a thought process, no speaking, okay? This is just thought coming off of a human. And it was clean water that was Mayim Chaim. It was water that had been gone through a filtration process, which is exactly what that mikvah process is. It's keeping the bad stuff out of the water by creating that swirling, right? Or a river that's moving down and removing the impurities, right? Which obviously we can't necessarily trust anymore because of all the bacteria and the pollution and all those other things. But they purify this water, and they subject it to positive thought, and it actually started forming perfect crystalline fractal patterns when it was frozen. So we understand that thought affects water, and we understand then that water has to be something other than just hydrogen and oxygen atoms. But then also we need to understand that it brought forth animals. If you accept that, if you can accept the mythos aspect, I've shown you the scientific aspect. If you can accept the mythos aspect of it, then all of a sudden we accept that it's an Elohim that's not only subject to us, which is how somebody could walk on it if they were operating as an Elohim the way they're supposed to be, instead of freaking out, just like the Jews did with Yeshua about being called a God. Remember, they were going to stone him to death, and he's like, come on, it's right there in the Psalms. What's your problem? What's your problem? Why are you angry that I'm making myself equal with God when it says right in there, you're Elohim? Of course I'm making myself equal with God. You're equal with God. Get over it. That was his principle. And so when we identify that and understand those processes, then we start to get into an understanding that we're dealing with all kinds of energies here. And if there are benevolent energies, then rest assured there are malevolent energies, right? There are energies out there trying to do the opposite processes, okay? And that is where we have what? A lack of water creating a malevolency, a lack of water in the wilderness, a thirst in the wilderness, creating a malevolency that creates what? A confession of darkness. God brought us out here into the wilderness to die of thirst, right? Then we have water coming from what? Aretz, water coming out of a rock, right? That's a whole nother discussion we can have. But the premise is now we understand that water is very, very, very powerful and is not what you thought it was. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that in and of itself, the word Mayim has not only a fractal pattern in it, which we can possibly get into in the discussion, but also Mayim means two or a double, a dual, some sort of double or very distinctly split in two, and no more than that concept, which could potentially be the two hydrogen. We could go with that, okay? But one final thing that you need to understand, and that is that when it says that the Mayim, it says that he called, who called? Source called, not God. That word Elohim is the seas, right? So, and he called Elohim seas, or Elohim waters, sea, Yod Mem, which is what? Yod is the actual hand, right? And it's the drawing of the hand. And the Mem being a drawing of water, which is accepted in Hebrew understanding, ancient pictographic Hebrew understanding as what? a work in chaos. What's chaos? Unpredictability, not limited by height, width, depth, time, and not limited by any restraints, which would be the perfect flow of water, which would also be the perfect flow of benevolence, which brings us to a very important point. Water, when it is Mayim Chayim, when it is actual clean water that's not been stagnant and not having the experience of pollutants in it, is benevolent. And that is very important as well. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, there's two things that are very important. You need to understand first that if flowing water is actually where the Elohim operates, right? And it's not, and it's part of the water cycle of flowing water, which ocean currents, etc. But also the premise that flowing water is rain, that flowing water is the water molecules or air moving around in the atmosphere, and if it condenses enough, it then what drops down, or if it intensifies enough. But what's also happening in that situation, lightning, which is a whole nother element of our light discussion. But the premise is that now we have this water cycle, which not only benefits us, right, because of the adenosine triphosphate, but also has the element of cyclicalness and dynamics. Point being, no matter what Elohim it is, it moves. It is dynamic. It is not static, which means in our process of healing, we need to move energy through someone. In our process of healing, we need to move water through someone. In our process of healing, we need to understand the deeper dynamics of the elements that people have rejected as, oh, that's witchcraft, that's magic, whatever. No, it's actually there in your Hebrew, which unfortunately you don't have and don't know. Instead, you have this English version saying, and God created the heavens and the earth, and God created and God said, let there be this in the sea, when actually what it's saying is, source tells the Elohim water to bring forth animals, to intensify energy, right? Etc., etc. So, I'm sorry, not animals, fish, right? Or swimmers that swim is actually what it says in the Hebrew. So now you understand that water is extremely important for the wilderness season, extremely spiritual in the wilderness season. In fact, I would, if I was you, often during the wilderness season, find a body of water, sit next to it, accept that there's some sort of energy connection between you and it that has something to do with it being a subordinate to you, but then also understand that it is proof of a water cycle that was provided just for you, which again puts you privileged above water even, right? And in all of that, there's a symbiotic connection between adenosine triphosphate and water, a symbiotic connection between the human being, 70% water, et cetera, et cetera. But then also how your thoughts can affect the water in somebody else. And not only that, but also can affect the water in the cycle itself. You could actually think about a stream being beautiful or a stream being ugly and affect the actual change in the process of that water. So now we're starting to understand that our creation that surrounds us has something more to offer, something more special in it. And also we need to understand that we play a role in that through the frequencies that we emanate. And I think that's another big piece of this is as we begin to grow and become more like what Yeshua was teaching the disciples to be, and what Paul was trying to teach people with his letters, which Peter said were super confusing, we actually have a very different religion in front of us. And what I mean by that is a very different practice, a very different honor and dishonor of the things around us, and a very, very different set of rules than what this world understands right now. We are literally going around eating cockroaches, shrimp, and we are eating trash compactors, pigs, and we are going around and we are inhaling into our bodies poisons, right? Mixed by witches, or what you would say the cigarette companies or the other companies who are putting things into food and putting things into it, which is a practice of witchcraft. That's actually what it means in the Hebrew, is to poison someone or to use what? The natural order processes that are already present in the earth, including the Elohim, by the way, right? They know about the Elohim more than you do because you were not given that understanding. But they have an understanding of that. Why? Because they come from peoples who still understood and practiced the use of those energies. Having said that, they what? Manipulate natural order processes in order to influence human behavior for a malevolent purpose. That's the actual ancient pictographic definition of a witch. So now we understand that we have all these things influencing us, all these different malevolent energies, as it were. We don't even need to get into demonology and still see the destruction of humankind as a result of a lack of understanding of what's really going on around them. Water is just one subject that we could address in this. We could address arets. We could address all those things. And you need to remember, you are actually water, as well as being Elohim above water, which is a whole nother discussion, which we may have in the Midrash. Okay, enough about those things. In short, you understand now that the wilderness season is about water, and specifically about a special kind of situation, which is what? Chaos. And chaos, as it is received, then goes from a vessel of reception into a vessel of conception. And that vessel of conception is an intensification of power within the vessel, which causes them to become an Elohim. And so that process itself then creates a concentrism of intensification of all power in the universe down to where we have actual molecular structures in the realm of height, width, depth, time. And so now you can understand how important it is to understand the vastness of what a human really is. You are made up of arets, right? We are made from dirt. You are made up of mayim. We are 70% water. And we breathe air. We can talk about that in terms of it being sky or the sky Elohim. But in principle, what you need to understand is you're made up of the very things you have command over, which means that potentially you could have command over your own healing. That's a whole nother subject. Now, I think that you guys get what we have gone through today, and hopefully it hasn't been too confusing. And I'm sorry I had to drag you through the Hebrew grammar there, but I'm showing and proving to you that it just doesn't logically jive to try to stuff things into a box. We need to let them be out and flow, and we need to let them be open, including your heart, to the things that your world has been trying to tell you. Remember, Paul said they're without excuse for everything that needs to be understood about what? Elohim, right? The invisible attributes of God. What? The divine nature, right? Is in what? Creation. The things that are made. You're made. So within you is Elohim and the understanding of Elohim. All right. So I will say, anybody who is on YouTube, I'm going to say Shabbat Shalom to, and thank you for listening in. And we will see you next time. Shabbat Shalom.